Hi there, and welcome to Pax Politica, the place where peace building and visual storytelling come together. We hope you enjoy this video, and if you do, please do like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, I want to talk a little bit about peace building for emerging young professionals. What was your first very professional experience with mediation, and how do you think it has changed over the years, especially for young peace builders in this day and age?
So in many ways, I stumbled into this world. What drove me intellectually was a desire to understand the Soviet Union and the experience of the Soviet Union, and that led me to study Soviet history, to learn Russian. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, I then found another way of exploring those issues through working for in the conflict resolution and peace building environment. I think one of the most important experiences I had was in the winter of 1992 when I was no, I beg your pardon, in the early winter of 93 when I was relatively new in this domain of work. And I had a meeting in Moscow with a representative of the leadership of Abkhazia. And I'd been involved in working on the situation just for a couple of months, and I did not understand nearly enough about what was happening. And this individual tore me to shreds intellectually. He deconstructed my understanding of the conflict. Clearly, he was representing his own party's experience of the conflict, but it was a very powerful experience for me to understand conflict from the perspective of a political actor at the heart of the conflict, and to realize that I needed to be very careful about the assumptions I brought. And it taught me important lessons about listening to the people who were experiencing conflict. And I took that then into relationships I had with people on either side of the conflict divide. And I hope it taught me some lessons about humility and about listening and about what it is that we as outsiders can contribute. And I hope it shaped the way that I've engaged in peace building and peace processes since. So I think it's a real challenge that you might have strong opinions, but you have to think, where do you deploy them in a process? And it raises questions that perhaps people are challenged by today around impartiality and neutrality, because one can get incredibly angry and frustrated about the injustice one sees in the world. And then you have to ask, what role do I want to play in relation to that? And there are some roles which are about advocacy, and I think those are admirable. And I think speaking out and standing in solidarity and accompanying people is critically important. But if you want to be involved in dialogue and mediation, you have to tread a difficult path of thinking, if I or we as an organization speak out about particular injustices and abuses, will that compromise our ability to work across a conflict divide? Will it compromise the degree to which conflict parties can look at us as actors they can work with? Or will they think that we're just going to be making outspoken judgments about them? And so I think anyone wanting to come into the field of peace building needs to ask themselves that questions in relation to that discourse. Do I feel the need to be an outspoken advocate against injustice? If so, I'd say you're probably more likely to find your domain in human rights organizations. And that, I think it couldn't be, it's so important. There's no critique there at all. Marrying the different approaches together can be tricky. And it doesn't mean that you don't ignore injustice, you don't ignore human rights abuses. You need to find different ways to talk about them and work on them that enable you to continue working across multiple conflict divides.
But then, why do you think we haven't seen young people's voices being reflected or represented in mediation and negotiation processes? Why do you think we haven't seen enough of young people's voices being reflected or represented in peace building, mediation, and negotiation processes, despite UN Security Council Resolution 2250?
It's a great question, and I'm really glad you referenced the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. And I'd recommend anyone interested in that to read the Progress Report by Graham Simpson, which is an incredible exploration of the way in which young people can play roles. Generational change is always tough. Hierarchies exist, power structures exist, and I think we are seeing more and more young people play active and dynamic roles. It can be hard for them to get traction, but actually I see young people in many of the conflicts where we work, they're not waiting to be given a role, they're seizing the role. They're getting involved in the transformation of their own societies and involving in politics and involving in peace processes. But it doesn't mean that there's an easy and direct route to sitting in peace talks, for instance. But one of the things I've been saying all along is I don't think we should be seeing involvement in peace talks as the apogee of how conflict transformation happens. I think it happens in many different domains of society, and young people are involved in those. No doubt there's a need for more of it.
If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. At Pax Politica, we tell stories throughout the world of peacebuilding and human rights that aren't covered by mainstream media. And every bit of support from you would help us do exactly that. So hit that like button and share the video with your friends and colleagues. We'll see you next time, and thanks for watching. See you in the next one.